Every year there are momentous stories in the news, some tales of unbelievable achievement. Some stories inspire us, others can make us concerned, and some news stories will make us angry. But it turns out we can't always believe everything we read and see in the news. My name's Tim White, and I've been investigating.
You are fake news. You are fake news.
Here in Ukraine, they reckon they know a thing or two about fake news. Since the revolution here in 2014, there have been many fake news stories. But is it a new phenomenon? Does it even matter? And what can or should be done to combat the global spread of fake news?
I have hope that we're going to be able to get beyond the post-fact era. I don't think that we can put a tombstone on facts just yet. There are definitely a lot of people out there who realize that fake news is very dangerous, even to social cohesion, at its basest, and they're doing something about it.
For NATO, particularly in the Baltic region, Russian propaganda's got really good in a way that would have been almost unimaginable back in the 1990s.
The thing with a lie is if you have a lie about something that's happened in the public domain, the shooting down of MH17, if it's happened in a public space, people share information about it online now.
Disinformation is the deliberate spreading of a lie, and the problem is that these days, given the internet, given the satellite communications, you can tell a lie in Moscow and literally have it broadcast live in Auckland and Sydney and Vancouver and Beijing simultaneously. So disinformation can spread at the speed of the internet.
In 2016, the US presidential election was memorable for many reasons. But one moment in particular caught the eye of millions. But this story was pure fantasy. Although it didn't stop thousands from believing it, and many shared the story on social media. US-based journalist and filmmaker Simon Ostrovsky remembers it well.
Well, I think the Pope story is a perfect example of a fake news story catching on like wildfire, because the Pope is a well-respected figure for hundreds of millions, if not billions, of people around the world. And for him to have endorsed Donald Trump would have been sending a really important signal to people who were maybe sitting on the fence about his candidacy. And that story, really had an impact. A lot of people saw it, and by the time it was debunked, I don't know whether more people saw the original story or more people saw the debunking.
Of course, call it what you will, fake news or disinformation is nothing new. In the Second World War, Nazi Germany used William Joyce, nicknamed Lord Haw-Haw, to try to demoralise Allied troops with propaganda radio broadcasts. Gregory Asmolov is a Russian-born journalist and researcher now based in London.
So I think that the fake news is not a new phenomenon. We could always see that information is manipulated by different type of institutions in different type of countries, in the West, in Russia, in other places in the world. But as we can see today, the new information technologies provided new tools and new forms of manipulation. It's based on a different type of aspects of information technologies, including something that's called algorithmic power, because today the information that we see, the decision what type of information we see are made not by human agents but often also by some algorithms. For instance, when we follow our Facebook newsfeed, what we see there is actually based on different type of algorithmic aspects of how the newsfeed is structured. And if you understand how this newsfeed works, you to some extent are able to manipulate what is more visible and what is less visible.
I'm here in the heart of London's financial district. Many commuters will get their news from free newspapers such as this, and many more from online sites while on the trains or on the metro. The problem is that fake news is designed to distort reality, and many fear that could lead to instability. One thing's for sure, what financial institutions and the City of London doesn't like is instability.
I think that it's a national security priority for all governments to worry about their information space, who is telling their population things, which bits of the population are believing this and why. They need to think about this in terms of hostile foreign actors, also in terms of domestic subversion such as terrorism, and they need to counter it with a mixture of rebuttal and myth-busting, to some extent looking at the vehicles with which these hostile messages are being got across and seeing if there's anything from a legal or regulatory point of view that needs to be done, and also with strong counter-messaging. We did all this during the Cold War when it was a matter of existential survival, so we knew how to do it, we've just kind of forgotten, and I think we need really to get back into gear in the way we were during the Cold War.
Edward Lucas has written many books and articles about Russia, and he's not alone in his views. One former NATO employee is adamant it's more than just harmless disinformation.
2 nights of rioting in Tallinn, shops set fire, 1 guy stabbed to death and at least 1 journalist being assaulted. That's more than just disinformation. Fake news which spreads to thousands of accounts on social media and gets believed and gets regurgitated is more than disinformation. Fake stories that the annexation of Crimea was provoked because NATO was about to set up a naval base there, which then gets repeated in national parliaments by members of parliament, that's a problem. The disinformation is so pervasive and so long-lasting that it gets picked up and it gets recycled, and it gets repeated and it gets believed, and sometimes it gets believed by policymakers.
In recent history, many became aware of fake news for the first time because of events in Ukraine and then Syria. Using modern innovations available to anyone, one British man was on the trail of the purveyors of false facts even before that, with remarkable success.
So I really see it as not something that's intelligence, although there are applications to kind of the intelligence service. Really, I mean, maybe you could call it citizen intelligence if you want. I try not to put a label on it, I just try and encourage more people to do it. What we had with Libya, which is where I started, is lots of kind of reports on social media about events from journalists, and they would drive past a town and say, oh, they're bombing this town or something like that. But I noticed a lot of these stories were being kind of not put together because they were off busy doing something else. So I started looking at this and thinking, well, what if we track this stuff? Then someone, I shared a video once and someone said, well, how do you know this is true? And I thought, actually, how do I know that? So I thought, well, there's a big mosque in it. I'll go to the town mentioned and look at the mosque and see if it's there. And, lo and behold, it was there. It was the same shape and design.
As war raged in Ukraine and Russia denied responsibility, Simon Ostrowski created a remarkable video, Selfie Soldier. Now back in New York, he explained how the idea came about.
So, I covered the Ukrainian conflict for a couple of years, and one thing that I noticed was how low the levels of trust in media were on both sides of the conflict, because so many fake stories and disinformation were being injected into the information space, frankly, by both sides, by Russia and by Ukraine. And in a conflict environment, this is done to confuse your enemy and to boost morale in your supporters. So it's not the same as with an election here in the United States. It's a bit of a different situation, but the net effect is the same in that trust in any information that people get is very low. And realizing that it was going to be very, very difficult to convince anybody of anything, I tried to devise a way of showing that I had done the verification myself to try to find out if Russia had used its military in Ukraine. At the time, Russia was denying that any of its forces were involved and that it was a party to the conflict at all. Anybody who had been covering the war realized that that was just simply untrue, but the problem was getting our viewers to understand that. what I did was I traced the social media posts of a Russian soldier who'd been photographing himself in Ukraine. If I just posted those photographs on our news website and said, look, it's a Russian soldier in Ukraine, job done, case closed, people could have very easily said, well, you just took a picture of a Russian soldier from another conflict and wrote your own caption on it, why should we believe you? So I went out to the places where the soldier actually took the pictures and took pictures of myself in the same poses as he was on the very locations that he took them in order to establish that I had verified where those photographs came from. And then I tracked that soldier down and I found him to show that he was indeed a real soldier in the Russian military.
Also in Ukraine in early 2014, a group of academics and journalists, fed up with Russian propaganda, came up with a new idea.
Я сиділа на роботі, розшифровувала інтерв'ю на іншій роботі, я працюю в ньюзрумі, і заглядала в групу на Фейсбуці, в якій йшло обговорення того, що робити з російською пропагандою, з тією кількістю фейків, яка зараз виникла. І я просто написала два рядки, що давайте зробимо сайт, в якому будемо збирати неправдиві новини про Україну і спростовувати їх. Всі підхопили цю ідею. Наша аудиторія дуже схвально сприйняла це. Тобто ми просто були вражені реакцією, насправді, тому що вже через 2 години ми написали невеличку статтю в інтернеті про те, що створений такий проєкт, який спростовує неправдиву інформацію про події в Україні, зокрема в Криму. І вже за 2 години було 13 тисяч репостів цієї новинки. Тобто ми фактично наступного дня ми вже були популярні. Просто от багато людей нам писали, пропонували допомогу, присилали фейки. Не було проблеми шукати фейкові новини, щоб їх спростовувати. Їх просто присилали, а дехто навіть вже спростовував і присилав готові спростування. Люди дуже дякували нам за те, що ми є. За те, що ми це робимо. Спочатку за це взялися близько 80 людей, волонтерів, всі хотіли брати участь. Потім виявилося, що у всіх є робота, що всі зайняті, всім треба заробляти гроші. Людей ставало все менше, менше і менше. Були моменти, коли ми збиралися просто і говорили, що чи буде існувати проєкт, чи ні. І, звичайно, що доклали всіх зусиль для того, щоб він існував.
Founders of the Stop Fake site soon realized a more sinister side to proceedings.
So the very first story I wrote for the Stop Fake website was about Ukrainian refugees in Russia. There were a lot of reports in Russian media, and it was reports about thousands of Ukrainian refugees in Russia. And I called to Federal Migration Service of Russia, and they told me we had just 5 phone calls from people from Ukraine. So we don't understand where this information came from. And so there is no Ukrainian refugees in Russia, the answer is. And, but that lady I called, she told me, but we have received the order from Moscow to prepare hundreds of places for refugees. But there were no refugees. It was 2 months before all the events in the east of Ukraine began. So suddenly I realized that having information about messages they send through their media, you can kind of predict what's going on. And I have a lot of such kind of examples when following and paying attention to messages Russian media and Russian propaganda sends, you can predict the future.
So far we've heard a lot about the history and some of the dangers of fake news. But what's been done to tackle the problem? Well, quite a lot actually. Facebook, Twitter and a host of top international broadcasters now support First Draft, an organisation specifically set up in response to this growing menace.
We had 30 partners, news organisations join in September when we first launched the partner network, and we've got a little over 80 now in terms of organisations who want to work together and find some solutions to this and see how we can verify news and how we can work together to find solutions to these problems that are challenging journalism and media and social media at the moment.
And the general public is using its eagle eyes too.
some of the work we've done with Bellingcat, we've used crowdsourcing, for example, to analyse large amounts of information. When the Russian Ministry of Defence started publishing videos of its bombing of Syria, they had gun camera videos showing the bombs hitting their targets, and they were describing them as being ISIS targets. So we basically crowdsourced these locations. We asked people who were kind of following Bellingcat's work to find these locations on Google Earth. And you're basically, doing spot the difference. You find the satellite image on Google Earth and you look at the, video, and you can see they're the same. What we discovered there is the Russian Ministry of Defence's own videos showed that they were not bombing Islamic State targets.
Donald Trump used the term fake news to strike back against the media, some of whom had reported the existence of a dossier which alleged that Moscow had compromising material on the now president. That report is believed to have been written by Christopher Steele, a former British spy who used to work here at the home of the British Intelligence Service.
CNN reported that a dossier, a two-page summary, of a specific intelligence dossier had been shown to Obama and to Trump. BuzzFeed then published the dossier in full. Now that, to a degree, is showing the working of the halls of power in Washington, because decisions were being made, and that dossier had been circulated for months. Trump shouting fake news just at a press conference isn't helpful, and ultimately undermines him to a large degree as well. Just shouting fake news seems desperate to a certain degree, but really, if people are, news organizations, whether that's CNN or BuzzFeed or anyone else, can show why they're doing this in the first place and show the steps that they've taken, hopefully that will help to dispel accusations like that.
And I thought that the dossier on Mr. Trump was a good example of raw intelligence, stuff that had been collected in Russia quite ably from quite interesting range of sources, but it hadn't been checked, because whereas a state intelligence agency can cross-check what its human sources say with other human sources and also with electronic intercepts and what other intelligence agencies are saying, a private intelligence company basically has to go on the basis of what it's been able to collect itself, and that means that the quality of intelligence is much less. It doesn't mean that it is all wrong, but at least some of it is going to be wrong.
So fake news can be a problem on both sides of the Atlantic. It's a hotly debated topic, and Western governments appear to be catching up belatedly.
I think what you've seen is the methods of disinformation have remained pretty constant, and I think of them as the 4 Ds: dismiss, distort, distract, and dismay. So something that I have seen a lot with particularly Russian government communications, but also I must say with other disinformation actors in other areas. If you criticize their action, or if you say that something they've done is wrong, the first thing that will happen is they will dismiss you. They will say, well, you shouldn't even listen to this guy because he used to work at NATO, or because he's a Russophobe, or because he hates Putin, or because he's corrupt, or he's a Nazi, or whatever. They will just dismiss you.
I have what I call the 4 Ps of fake news. They're basically the reasons that it's created, disseminated, and why people share it. So I say there's the propaganda reasons, there's political reasons, there's reasons of passion, and there's reasons for profit.
There was one story which provoked so much anger and was easily debunked, alleging a child had been crucified by Ukrainian nationalists. Many believe this story helped Russia sign up volunteers for the war in Ukraine.
I also could see some kind of emotional wave of anger from the side of people who believe in this story, and some great frustration from people who question this story. So again, you could see that the online follow-up was full of emotions, anger, engagement, and this is the major problem about this type of fake news. It's not only the information which is probably fake, but the way it changed the attitude of people and the way they feel about the conflict, and the way they communicate to other people, and the way this type of fake news actually destroy the social ties between people that were connected before. So this type of polarization, which is caused or supported by fake news, I think it's one of the major challenges that we need to face.
I think that people have been untrustful of the news in Russia for a very long time, and that comes with the Soviet legacy. What's been surprising to me has been that people have been very happy and eager to gobble up, this new phenomenon of Russian fake news on steroids, because if at least in the early Putin years they tried to stick to the facts and spin it in a way that was helpful to the government, right now we've got a situation where journalists are literally making stories up and falsifying events, portraying them as if they happened when they never did happen. And that's a very big shift from what we've had before. We used to argue about whether news can be unbiased and whether people ever don't have an agenda. Today I think it's shifted way beyond talking about whether stories have an agenda. Today it's whether stories actually took place at all.
It seems like almost everything in our ever-changing world that the techniques used for creating and disseminating propaganda are constantly evolving.
I think that the new thing is you have a very powerful country, Russia, which has real capabilities in hacking, is hacking information and leaking it. That's number one, that they are able to use the anonymity of the internet to create websites that look like news sites but that aren't. They're able to come up with stories that are utterly untrue, like the Lisa case in Germany, and spread these around using the speed and ubiquity of the internet to have a political effect. All these things are quite new compared with the old Soviet model of disinformation, which was much more ponderous and much easier to track.
What has changed is the aggression and the blatancy of the disinformation. There's much more of it. It's much more far out, and it goes right up to the top. The classic example would be President Putin was asked in a press conference in early March 2014, who are those people in Crimea who have now taken over the government buildings, these famous little green men with military uniforms but no insignia. And Putin said, those are local self-defense forces. And later on he said, there are no Russian forces in Ukraine. A year later he said, well, yes, that was a Russian Special Forces operation and I ordered it, and I will tell you all about the meeting where I ordered it and where I said that this had to happen. So you have the president of one of the UN Security Council permanent members blatantly lying in a press conference for an understandable strategic and tactical reason. He wanted to make sure that the operation went ahead. But actually to have a world leader lying like that on camera is relatively rare. And to break, there are many ways of evading the truth. Many leaders do them. Again, this is not a purely Russian thing. But to do a flat-out lie is quite striking.
And some organisations and news outlets have struggled to dodge propaganda.
The question around that would be who is saying what is true and what is not, and how, again, those conclusions are reached. And that's something which Facebook, I think in particular, has been struggling with, and not wanting to be known as a media company, because they don't want to be those arbiters of truth. And that's why they're bringing in a number of third parties to do that. Ideally, yes. Ideally, it would only be true information, that is being circulated. But again, the question the follow-on question is that's who decides what's true and what is not. Which is why I think in all of these processes, whether it's social networks, whether it's news organizations, showing the working, being open about how specific conclusions are reached and allowing people to follow that process makes things much less opaque. That's one of the big kickbacks which the last year has shown us from the rise of populism, as many have called it, is because many see the media and news organizations as part of this global elite who are covering things up and pushing a set of interests. And by opening up the reporting process, and whether that's on Facebook or whether that's news organizations, into how conclusions are reached, can help to make it more transparent and can help to rebuild trust there.
One of the most tragic tales with allegations of alternative facts and fake news surrounds the downing of Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 in eastern Ukraine in July 2014, with the loss of almost 300 lives. Russia strongly denies any responsibility, But those intent on exposing fake news point to what they say is one of their greatest successes.
I think from a purely propagandist aspect was the case of MH17, because what you saw coming from the Russian Ministry of Defense in their July 21st press conference on, a few days after MH17 was shot down are all provable lies. And really, when you think about it, nearly 300 people had died, and the first reaction from Russia was to present fakes, lie about their evidence, and they were completely shameless about it. And to compound that, 2 years later, they said they had lost their radar data, and all of a sudden they find it again. But this time, the radar data, which had previously shown a Ukrainian jet near MH17, didn't show anything near MH17. So their own data contradicted their own press conference. So, when you have that level of just barefaced lying, I mean, that is really, it's hard to beat that.
So we've seen some of the devastating effects that fake news can have, particularly in war zones. Here in Ukraine, where nearly 10,000 people have died in the ongoing conflict, they're still searching for solutions.